This time, on combat ships. One of the riskiest amphibious assaults in history, in one of the most treacherous harbors in the world.
You have to go in at high tide, and if you don't win before the next low tide, you're in big trouble.
Using the most powerful ships ever built.
The 16-inch guns aboard the Missouri can hurtle two types of projectiles more than 23 nautical miles. The large ones weigh in at 2,700 pounds, which is like hurling a Volkswagen Beetle through the air.
The Battle of Inchon, the world's last great amphibious assault. Combat ships. Fast, effective.
His orders were to find the British and to pick a fight.
Going right to the heart of the battle.
The Marines have always thought of themselves as the spear point of United States military power. Their whole doctrine of combat was to go fast, hit hard, get it over with in a hurry.
Combat ships have changed the world.
She gained her freedom. Now she's going down the river with an army. She was like, we're about to show you what we're working with.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews.
The rule of thumb on a frigate is you can lose 2 spaces and stay afloat. But if you lose a third, you go to Davy Jones's locker in a hurry.
In June 1950, Communist North Korea launched an attack on the South. They captured South Korea's capital, Seoul, and cornered thousands of US, UN, and South Korean troops in the south at Pusan.
Well, this is not a very large area, and you don't have any room to mass reserves. You don't have any room for counterattacks. You don't have any room to maneuver.
The retreating US troops were trapped.
I remember we got the order to hold at all cost. We fall back no further. This is it. You stay here, you defend, or you die. But we're not falling back anymore. And that was one of the most scary moments I think I had in South Korea.
It was a living hell. They thought that they are dying there. They thought that they are losing the war completely. So you can say that it was a kind of Korean version of Dunkirk during the World War II to the United States Army.
It was clear that North Korea's initial plan was working. So by late August, vast majority of the Korean peninsula was occupied by North Korean forces.
The North Korean army appeared invincible. The United States faced humiliating defeat. After World War II, Korea had been divided into the American-backed South under the leadership of Syngman Rhee and the Soviet-backed Communist North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung.
North Korea at this time was a highly ambitious country led by a charismatic, very capable leader, Kim Il-sung. And his immediate mission was to reunify the peninsula under the socialist government, and he sought the support of the Soviet Union and the young country, People's Republic of China. And by early 1950, he was ready to take over South Korea.
Kim Il-sung intended to destroy the rival government in the South. He didn't believe the US would come to the aid of its ally.
At this time, there was no significant US military presence in South Korea. South Korea's military itself was much less developed and prepared.
President Truman called on the UN to resist the invasion. He feared the spread of communism in the Far East. He persuaded an international UN force under the authority of the United States to defend South Korea. For the first time, the United Nations was going to war. They began with a massive naval blockade of North Korea's ports.
With aerial resources providing patrol, with destroyers and other warships available offshore to inspect traffic, you can ensure that the enemy is not putting any goods into those ports, which forces them to move everything overland, which makes fighting all that much more difficult.
Today, one of the blockade ships is moored in London, the mighty cruiser HMS Belfast.
HMS Belfast at the time of the Korean War was still really quite a new warship with many of the high-end capabilities. So while not perhaps quite as new as some of those that had been just launched in the last years of the Second World War, it was still quite an effective fighting platform.
Ron Yardley was one of the ship's crew.
When we sailed from Chatham, I knew that I wasn't going to see my mother again, God willing, for another 2 years. It was such a big adventure, not knowing what the end was when we got to Korea. You had a lot of apprehension, and I don't deny the fact that you got scared.
HMS Belfast patrolled the Korean coast, sailing over 80,000 miles in the combat zone. UN ships were controlling the seas, but the thousands of troops they had hastily deployed were still trapped in Pusan and facing disaster. The commander-in-chief of the UN forces was General Douglas MacArthur. He was America's most famous general.
He was a brilliant soldier. The problem with Douglas MacArthur is he knew it, and he tended to surround himself with yes men and sycophants. He tended to believe his own press, and many found him absolutely intolerable.
He was also someone who thought an all-out war was the only way to solving a military conflict.
MacArthur devised a plan to break out of the Pusan perimeter and drive the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel. It would require hundreds of men and ships. MacArthur's plan had to succeed, or the men in Pusan faced capture or death.
It was clear to everyone, not only the Americans and the South Koreans, but to the North Koreans as well, that the way out of this was not just simply to fight forward out of that enclave, but to conduct an amphibious end run. The question was, how big of an end run?
To rescue the trapped men at Pusan, General MacArthur proposed an amphibious landing involving over 260 ships at a place called Inchon. Inchon was the port for Seoul, and 110 miles behind enemy lines. The landing would disrupt North Korean supplies and open a war on two fronts. The odds were stacked against MacArthur's plan. After World War II, the US military had made massive cuts. Some believed the Marines and the Navy were irrelevant in an age when an atomic bomb could end a war with a single blast. But most serious of all was that Incheon Harbor was no easy target. It is at the end of a treacherous passage known as Flying Fish Channel, a narrow, winding entrance that could quickly become a trap.
The Bay of Incheon is known for the largest tidal difference. High tide and low tide, and the difference on average was 8.2 meters. And worst case is 11 meters.
It is one of the fastest shifting tidal basins in the world. And when the tide goes out, vast mudflats are exposed.
If you get in there and have to get out and the tide goes down, you can't. So you better get it right the first time. You have to go in at high tide, and if you don't win before the next low tide, you're in big trouble.
The fear was that the invasion forces would be stuck in the mud, sitting ducks.
Because of that, the North Koreans thought nobody's going to be mad enough to attack here. But General MacArthur was.
MacArthur was unmoved. He felt his record in World War II spoke for itself.
MacArthur has a reputation for coming up with a strategy of leapfrogging. In other words, he advanced up the coast of New Guinea, for example, by a series of amphibious landings that did not take on the enemy's strong points, but landed behind the enemy's strong points and basically used amphibious warfare as a form of maneuver warfare. Although I am no fan of MacArthur, that was one of the things that he was able to do quite successfully.
On August 23rd, at a conference in Tokyo of top U.S. military leaders, MacArthur spoke about the troops trapped at Pusan.
Are you content to let our troops stay in that bloody perimeter like beef cattle in the slaughterhouse? Who will take the responsibility for such a tragedy? Certainly, I will not.
MacArthur's plan, codenamed Operation Chromite, would be the largest naval operation since World War II. General MacArthur's controversial plan for an amphibious rescue mission behind enemy lines at the port of Inchon called for a multinational fleet of over 260 vessels. Just like D-Day 6 years before, such a large fleet would not have the element of surprise. The enemy would be waiting for them. So, MacArthur staged an elaborate deception to make the North Koreans believe that Kunsan, 100 miles to the south, was the target.
It was a much more practical place to land. You could come ashore in the mast landing like we're accustomed to thinking of, all the lines of landing craft, landing on the beach.
American and British ships bombarded Kunsan. Planes from carriers hit railroads and bridges north to Pyongyang. The North Koreans fell for it. Kim Il-sung deployed forces to protect Kunsan. In General MacArthur's real invasion plan, 75,000 U.S. troops would land at Inchon. They would come ashore on 3 beaches. First, the Marines would seize Wolmi-do, codenamed Green Beach, a fortified island that controlled the entrance to the harbor, where North Korean artillery and Marine regiments were dug in, armed with Soviet-made coastal artillery. Then 12 hours later, at the next high tide, U.S. Marines would seize Red Beach, right in the heart of the city. Blue Beach to the east would be the final landing. Inchon would then have to be taken street by street. Once the beaches and city fell, the 3 forces would then make a combined attack on Seoul. Aerial reconnaissance revealed a network of fortifications across Inchon. Many were unmanned, but MacArthur believed that the North Koreans would rush troops from Seoul to defend the harbor, so the invaders would have to establish beachheads fast. The UN forces lacked intel about Inchon's tides, mudflats, and defenses. Operation Chromite would fail without it. In early September, a reconnaissance team landed secretly near Inchon and set up a base on an island in the harbor. In charge was 39-year-old U.S. Navy Lieutenant Eugene Clark.
He's been involved in covert operations in the Second World War, and he's clearly academically gifted. He has learnt Japanese and Chinese during the Second World War. and clearly was in just the right place to help out at the Inchon operation.
Clark and a team of South Korean officers recruited a network of locals to spy for them.
He relays back a vast array of information about troop dispositions, numbers of troops, what the beaches are like. He goes wading through the mud on one night to try and work out how bad it is, and the answer was very.
Clark and his men seized a sampan as a makeshift combat ship and equipped it with a machine gun. They began secret missions to scout Inchon Harbor. The North Koreans became suspicious and sent out their own sampans to find out what was going on.
So they get in their boats and there is a battle at sea. And Clark very successfully shoots up the North Korean improvised gunboat, and then he and his men proceed to shoot up and sink many of the troop-carrying sampans, and the North Koreans give up for the day.
Their cover blown, Clark and his men hunkered down and waited for the invasion fleet. The key vessels in that fleet were 85 massive landing craft, known as Landing Ship Tank, or LSTs. No LSTs from Korea survive, but this veteran of D-Day is identical to those deployed at Inchon. Moored at Evansville, Indiana, this is LST-325. The heart of the LST is its 264-foot-long tank deck. The ship was designed around its cargo.
Built to carry 20 Sherman tanks. That's what it's built around. Tanks are in there 3 abreast, about 7 rows out. So they designed this ship basically around that load there. The LST can deliver a whole lot of stuff. 20 tanks, 30 trucks, and 200 troops. Pick it up in one country, go across the ocean, and land on the beach and deliver all of that stuff without the use of port facilities. That's what was revolutionary about it.
LSTs were designed for Allied amphibious landings in World War II. The ship is an unsung hero.
It's shaped like a big bathtub with cupboard doors in the front, so it doesn't look like much, but by golly, were they absolutely essential, not only to the Second World War, but at Inchon as well.
It took a particular skill to be a skipper of the flat-bottomed vessels.
It was a whole new learning curve because for the first time in the history of the world, a ship was built where the captain's paid to take it up on the beach. Usually that's not a good thing.
By 1944, LSTs were so essential that D-Day was delayed until enough LSTs were available.
This ship held up the largest armada in the history of the world. That's how important the LST was. Prime Minister Churchill of Great Britain, he said if he had to pick one thing that won that war, it would be the LST.
The man responsible for the LST was a naval designer named John Niedermeyer. He applied submarine technology to the LST. A sub is equipped with ballast tanks. When the tanks are filled with seawater, the sub sinks. When they are emptied, it surfaces. The LST also needs to rise and fall, increasing or decreasing the amount of the hull under the water. For stability on the ocean, it takes in seawater using 10 huge ballast tanks below the cargo deck, holding over 180,000 gallons. Before hitting the beach, the LST pumps out the ballast tanks, lifting more of the hull above the surface.
Pumping water in and out just like a submarine is what we're doing on an LST.
Despite the ballast system, it was a rough ride on the way to Inchon.
They're flat-bottomed, and we were riding through a storm, and those things it's just like that. And we had, we put cables to hold those big guns down because they're heavy. And they even snapped a couple of those cables. And there's not much you can do about that.
The LST wasn't designed for the open ocean. It was designed for the land. Although the bottom of the hull is flat, it's lower at the stern than at the bow, a difference of about 8 feet, the average gradient of beaches around the world. For centuries, warships have had watertight bows that cut through the sea. But the LST has a giant hole. It works, but barely.
The bow doors are there to break the water, but the bow ramp has a rubber gasket around it, makes it virtually watertight. I say virtually, nothing's 100%. The ramp is what makes it watertight. In the bow doors, there's actually a pool of water between the ramp. It's even been used for bathing or something else on an LST.
When LSTs first arrived, many naval officers predicted most would be sunk, because with a top speed of just 12 knots, they were vulnerable to air attack. The LST was mockingly called Large Slow Target. So crews were given the tools to defend themselves.
On an LST, you have 6 40-millimeter Swedish Bofors. These are anti-aircraft guns, which can be used to shoot at anything. But they're full automatic guns, which would reach up about 12,000 foot, full automatic. That's your main defense against enemy aircraft.
The most numerous weapons were 20-millimeter Ehrlichen automatic cannons fed by 60-round drum magazines, manned by a team of 5. The LST crews hoped that if the tide went out at Inchon, stranding them on the treacherous mudflats in range of North Korean guns, they would have the firepower to survive. On the morning of September 13th, 2 days before the Korean D-Day, the pre-invasion bombardment of Inchon began. British and American destroyers and cruisers opened fire on the fortified island of Wolmi-do, where North Korean artillery guarded the harbor.
When we started bombarding Inchon 2 days before the landing, that's when the Koreans said, oh my God, this is where they're coming. This is going to be the site.
The following day, U.S. Marine and British Fleet Air Arm pilots joined in the attack. Then D-Day dawned, September 15th, 1950. U.S. Navy spy Eugene Clark broke into the lighthouse at the entrance to the harbor and turned on the light.
With the lighthouse on, the invasion force can fix its position all the way through the very difficult navigational waters to the point where they can anchor and start the assault.
General MacArthur watched from the USS Mount McKinley as the Marines clambered into their landing craft and headed for Green Beach. At 6:33, the 3rd Battalion stormed the beach, keen to show that in a nuclear age, it was still the Marines who won wars.
The Marines have always thought of themselves as the spear point of United States military power. They took the hardest jobs, they took the biggest casualties. Their whole doctrine of combat was to go fast, hit hard, accept the casualties, get it over with in a hurry.
That doctrine paid off at Inchon. Following the first wave of Marines onto Wolmi-do, LSTs brought in tanks and supplies. The Marines advanced rapidly, and by 6:55, the Stars and Stripes flew over the island. General MacArthur sent a signal. The Navy and Marines have never shone more brightly than this morning. Only 17 men had been killed. But the tide was rapidly falling, exposing the infamous Inchon mudflats. The landings on red and blue beaches were impossible for another 12 hours. The invasion fleet waited offshore. Shelling had knocked out the defenders' Soviet-made artillery, but some North Korean infantry remained. Until the tide came back in The Marines on Wolmi-do were their only target.
Once you are stuck there, you cannot maneuver around, right? And you become an easy target of your enemy. And you're not going to have any other assistance or new arrival of the soldiers until 12 hours later. That's why it's very difficult.
It was a bad night. We were getting resistance. When the infantry goes through, they get what they get. They leave those that are in bunkers or those that are hid out, they're still there.
To help protect his force at Inchon, MacArthur continued to apply pressure elsewhere on the Korean peninsula. A veteran of World War II was playing a vital role, bombarding the key port of Samchok as a diversionary tactic. The USS Missouri. The Missouri was legendary, the last battleship built by the United States. She was launched in 1944 at the New York Navy Yard at a cost of $92 million. In the Pacific, she supported the landings at Iwo Jima and bombarded Okinawa, where the Missouri was attacked by multiple kamikazes. On September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese surrender ceremony marking the end of the war was held on her decks, overseen by General Douglas MacArthur.
Let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always.
The Missouri, nicknamed Mighty Mo, was built for long missions at sea.
She carries over 2.5 million gallons of fuel, and she burns 108 gallons per mile. Not miles per gallon, gallons per mile. And in fact, she can pretty much circumnavigate the globe on one tank of gas if she ever needed to.
The Missouri had the only active 16-inch guns in the fleet, and it was these mighty weapons General MacArthur wanted to bring into the Inchon landings. He wanted the North Koreans to think that the port of Samchok was another possible invasion spot, and that the Missouri was softening the port in advance of a full-on attack. To be on top of their game on September 4th, on their way to the conflict zone, the crew of the Missouri were filmed carrying out intense gunnery practice.
The 16-inch guns aboard the Missouri can hurtle two types of projectiles more than 23 nautical miles. The large ones weigh in at 2,700 pounds, which is like hurling a Volkswagen Beetle through the air. These rounds can travel that full distance in about 91 seconds because they travel faster than Mach 2.5, which means you can't shoot them down.
Almost 100 men were needed to load and fire the 3 guns in a 16-inch turret.
This compartment here is the turret officer's booth. From this space, the 16-inch guns can be locally controlled and locally fired. But right behind this bulkhead and these doors are the gun pits, where you actually load the guns, where the propellant, the bags of powder, those huge 2,700-pound rounds come up from the depths of the ship, are loaded into the back of the breech, and are eventually shot off the side of the ship. A good gun crew can fire 2 rounds per minute per barrel, which means if you do the math with 9 gun barrels firing 1 round every 30 seconds, the crew is able to stack more than 27 rounds in the air before the first one ever lands because they travel at Mach 2.5.
On September 15th, after an 11,000-mile dash across the Pacific, the Missouri arrived off the port of Samchok and began its diversionary bombardment. Her rounds had a devastating effect, able to punch through 16 inches of solid steel and 30 feet of concrete. That extreme firepower was hazardous for the Missouri's crew.
Sailors have reported even standing at a safe distance having their glasses ripped off their face, and in one instance the Missouri actually had a door removed from the bulkhead from the force of the blast.
After pounding Samchok for 2 days, the Missouri sailed west towards Inchon at top speed to support the landings. Her crew was uncertain what they'd find there. At Inchon on September 15th, the first day of the invasion, the tide was slowly creeping back in. The Marines that came ashore on Green Beach still held Womido. Now 2 waves of US and South Korean Marines were out at sea poised to attack the next targets, Red and Blue Beaches, where North Korean infantry defended the harbor and the roads to Seoul. The timing of the attack on Red and Blue Beaches was crucial. Assault waves of Higgins boats would hit the beach at 2-minute intervals. This part of the operation had to be completed within an hour to get out of the way of the next wave of LSTs. The Higgins boat had a proven track record.
You have size, you have speed, you have utility. These are all things that contribute to the success of any sort of weapon system. And the Higgins boat is a weapon system. It delivers a weapon, which is the men that it carries.
Traveling in a landing craft with the troops was veteran New York Herald Tribune journalist Marguerite Higgins, who'd covered the early days of the conflict. MacArthur had banned female reporters from the front line. He said there were no latrines for them, and his men's language was too crude. But Marguerite convinced him to let her go, saying that she'd walked out of Seoul at the start of the war and wanted to walk back in. She wrote later on the day of the invasion,
I heard the authoritative rattle of machine guns. Somehow the enemy had survived the terrible pounding they'd been getting. The Reds had sighted us, and their aim was excellent. We all hunched deep into the boat.
Red Beach would be the toughest to crack. No one had ever dared land in the middle of a city before. It was guarded by a 10-foot-high sea wall. The men would have to go over the top, World War I style, right into the sights of the North Korean defenders.
We had to make some ladders, and we said, what are these for? And they were 15-foot ladders. They'd got lumber from somewhere, and they said, well, we're going in, or you can't land because the tide goes out for 6 miles. Growing up in California, I seen the tide go out maybe 5 feet. We put the ladder up, and there we made the landing. In my mind, I never thought of danger.
The North Koreans thought nobody would be crazy enough to land in a city of 500,000 people over a seawall with a 30-foot tide up and down. And so we had 2 hours of daylight to secure our part of the town that night.
As the Americans came ashore, North Korean troops on Cemetery Hill, above Red Beach, opened fire on the LSTs.
When you're on a beach, you're pretty much a stationary target. So obviously your guns are manned at all times, and yeah, I would say it takes a certain kind of bravery to do that. The damage to LSTs at Inchon was basically from machine gun fire and mortars.
Undeterred, the LSTs unloaded their supplies and waited for the morning tide. At the same time as the Marines landed on Red Beach, 25 waves of landing craft headed for Blue Beach, to the east.
Blue Beach is a harder beach to attack geographically, but the real problem is all of the smoke and dust from the naval bombardment and the fires in Inchon, which is drifting out not just across the beach, but over the seaward approaches to the beach. And into this murk has to go the assault waves. in their landing craft. They don't just get intermingled, they get lost. And they arrive higgledy-piggledy on the beach.
Some troops landed an hour late and 2 miles off target. But the ship and aerial bombardment had almost completely wiped out the North Korean defenses. Eventually, the Marines took the high ground above Red Beach and linked up with the Marines from Green Beach. Together, they mopped up North Korean resistance in the city. They could now prepare to push forward through Inchon and attack Seoul. Inchon was beyond the range of U.S. Air Force bases in Japan, so carriers provided constant support as they dug in on the beaches. Although by 1950 the world was entering the jet age, jet aircraft weren't ready for short carrier flight decks. It was 2 high-performance propeller aircraft that carried out over 300 attacks on Inchon on the day of the invasion: the Corsair and the Sky Raider.
It could deploy a similar bomb load to a World War II B-17 bomber. It had all kinds of hard points for a wide variety of ordnance, bombs, rockets, and it had heavy cannon, 20-millimeter cannon armament, so it was formidable even if it got bounced by jets, as it happened in both Korea and Vietnam, where the Sky Raider came out the victor.
By 1950, the Corsair was too slow for air-to-air combat, but was a superb ground support aircraft, as it had been in the Pacific War.
It could carry a significant amount of ordnance, a variety of bombs, and rocket power.
Corsairs were able to stay airborne longer than jets, which burned fuel at a high rate.
It was also good for interdiction, such as shooting up railways or dropping bridges and such, because of its load capacity. So the Corsair still had enough power to be able to do the job from a variety of platforms in Korea, not only flying from short deck carriers and big deck carriers, but also from rough fields the Marines are operating ashore in Korea as well.
Both Corsairs and Sky Raiders dropped napalm at Inchon. It was a new weapon, first used in Normandy in 1944.
Napalm was new to North Korean Army. I don't think they never experienced anything like that. So everything just burned down.
They took this newfounded product called plastics, and they found that if you mix it with fuel, it kind of blends in with it, but it acts as a thickening agent. You then had a fluid gel that was highly ignitable, and it was almost impossible to extinguish.
Napalm was later used extensively in Vietnam. Because of its devastating effects, it is now banned by the U.S. military. Thanks to Corsair and Sky Raider airstrikes, shore bombardments, and the skill of the Marines, Inchon's red and blue beaches were secure by late evening on the 15th. Journalist Marguerite Higgins wrote,
"The sun began to set as we lay there. The yellow glow that it cast over the green-clad Marines produced a technicolor splendor. The strange sunset, combined with the crimson haze of the flaming docks, was so spectacular that a movie audience would have thought it overdone."
The Marines ashore dug in and waited for the North Korean counterattack. By the end of the first day of the invasion, 2 regiments of Marines had successfully landed at Inchon. There had been only 20 deaths and fewer than 200 casualties, and no sign of North Korean reinforcements. Now the troops needed to move inland, towards Seoul. For that, they needed big gun support. On September 19th, Mighty Mo, the USS Missouri, arrived at Inchon.
Having a battleship supporting any sort of troops on the shore is a huge morale boost. 16-inch guns are a terrifying weapon, and multiple Marines and other soldiers who have been stationed have always described that absolute sense of buoyancy that they get knowing that there's a battleship just offshore protecting them and providing gunfire support.
As the troops pushed on, the Missouri bombarded bridges, train lines, and enemy positions ahead of them. American generals called her the best infantry weapon the Army ever had. Along the east coast of Korea, the British cruiser HMS Belfast also blasted enemy positions.
Over the course of the Korean War, the 2.5 years that it was deployed, it fired over 8,000 shells, most of which were done by 6-inch guns. And in fact, the 6-inch gun fired more shells during the Korean War than they did throughout the whole of the Second World War.
The feeling is that when we were firing our guns, we were doing the job that we were sent there to do.
The landings at Inchon made an immediate difference to those men cornered at Pusan.
I do remember vividly when they said, we made an invasion and the war is going to be changed now. We left the perimeter, broke through, the very little resistance, and we had the North Korean army on the run. And they were surrendering by the thousands and thousands.
The battle to retake Seoul would be slow and bloody. For 10 days, Marines who landed at Inchon fought street to street in the South Korean capital. But with a steady stream of men and material coming ashore, the outcome was inevitable.
Inchon was an absolutely decisive event in the first part of the Korean War. It caused Seoul to be taken within a week or two, and it cut the North Korean forces off from their supplies from the north. The only thing the North Koreans could do after Inchon was retreat.
Seoul was captured, but General MacArthur wasn't satisfied. He ordered UN troops to cross the 38th parallel and enter North Korea, provoking the Chinese army to attack on October 25th. The conflict was escalating rapidly. President Truman became increasingly irritated with his maverick general. MacArthur had engineered an amphibious miracle at Inchon, but he was out of control. Truman relieved him of his command. Neither Truman nor the UN nor the North Koreans and their Chinese allies had an appetite for all-out war. Peace negotiations began in the summer of 1951.
The Korean War has many tragic elements. The millions of civilians that were killed, all the men and women of the military that gave their lives on the field. But one of the more difficult elements of this war was the fact that the negotiations to stop the war lasted for 2 years.
About 40,000 Americans lost their lives in Korea. About 500,000 North Korean and Chinese soldiers died. Civilians paid the highest price. It's believed between 3 and 4 million were killed. The armistice was finally signed in July 1953, but it brought no resolution. It was a ceasefire, not a peace agreement.
The historical impact of the Korean War is lasting to this day. The two countries remain divided, North Korea and South Korea. And of course, since the Korean War, the US military has not left the southern portion, South Korea, and even to this day has around 30,000 military personnel across the South Korean territory. It is still an unfinished war.